Bojan here, program manager with Microsoft on the customer experience engineering team for Azure Security Center. So me and my team, we work with a select set of Microsoft's largest customers to help them deploy and realize the full value of Azure Security Center. Again, a returning visitor here. Looking forward to a very interesting, lively conversation. Feel free if you have any questions throughout the presentation, either to come off mute. If you feel more at ease, you can also put it in the chat window. All of those options are great. So I'm delighted to be joining you again for this continuation of the conversation that you're having around security. But before we jump in, what I've thought I would do is just to get a sense, a flavor from all of you, how you see this topic. So let's start with one, but a very, very interesting mentee question. So for those of you who haven't used it before, you just put in www.mentee.com in your browser and you will need this code. So the code is 805226990. So again, it's 805226990. So with that, let me then go and switch gears. So I'll go and share the browser so we can all then see. And we already have not only our first question, but we also have our first couple of answers coming up. So the question is, what word comes to mind when you hear Azure Defender? So we have here security, very relevant, yeah. Secure Score, it's capability of Security Center, yeah. I'll leave it a couple more seconds. So we Windows Defender, that's an interesting one. So we get even more input here. Secure Azure resources, correct? It can provide dedicated security analytics for resources in Azure, best practices, just in time. That does sound like just in time access. So security of resources, correct? Also a good one. So let me see how much answers do we have. 18. Okay, let's give it a couple more seconds, and the answer is going to be this word cloud. Love it. Policies, that's a great catch. Network hardening, also a good one. AV, that's an interesting one. So we will touch base on that one as well. So we have 22 answers. Brilliant. So let me then go back to our deck. Just one sec. And thank you so much for all the answers. Okay. Hopefully, again, everyone can see my screen. It should be a PowerPoint presentation.
I can see that fine.
Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks for confirming. So what I want to talk today about, so my presentation is going to be all around Azure Security Center. So we're going to talk what's it intended for, what's it not intended for, how to go about implementing it in a real world scenario. And I'm also looking to share some insights that I've gathered while working with customers and helping them adopt and or deploy Azure Security Center. So what I've thought I would do is spend just a little bit of time talking about this concept of security hygiene to give us that foundational understanding around what we are seeing in the market and what are some of the trends. Then I'd like to touch briefly on what's called the cloud security posture management and how that's applicable around having good security hygiene, not just for Azure workloads or Azure resources, but also for multi-cloud resources and even hybrid workloads. Then we can talk about cloud workload platform protection. And here I want to touch on what was in the mentee questions, which is Microsoft's implementation of CWP called Azure Defender. And finally, I want to give a glimpse of Azure Security Center and kind of bring together and make real everything that we covered inside of the Azure portal through a live demo and on a high note with Q&A with as much as time as we have left. So that's our agenda for today. So Going into first, just very, very briefly, security hygiene and why it should be one of our, if not number one of our priorities. Here, I just want to touch briefly on the challenges that we're seeing companies and organizations facing. I did bring a couple of headlines with me to emphasize just how important security hygiene is. Unfortunately, still a significant portion of security breaches happens due to poor cybersecurity or security hygiene. As we are seeing the TTPs, so the tactics, techniques, and procedures of attackers continue to evolve, we even have here a couple of examples. For example, last year in March, we also saw attacks that shared coronavirus as the topic. Another one was then an increase in cyber attacks very, very close to the elections, which then shared the elections as the topic. And even this latest example of government entities and public sector being targeted. And again, based on the findings of the investigators, it showed that poor security hygiene was to blame here. So it wasn't even anything, I'm going to say, James Bond-like or like sci-fi. It were the basics that actually failed. And I want to acknowledge that this is a challenge. I do want to acknowledge that improving organization security posture, it is a journey. And a way we could look at this journey is in the form of a loops of protecting our workloads, detecting signs of compromise, either through telemetry, machine learning, or maybe even behavior monitoring, and then also responding to it by remediating those threats. So having an automation of sort. So we can even imagine it then as ever evolving feedback loop where after the fact, so we then apply those learnings to further protect our workloads, and it goes around in a circle. And what I hear from companies that migrate workloads to the cloud is they find themselves sometimes using security controls that are legacy to protect native cloud workloads. And fact is that security controls in the cloud, they do differ to those on premises. So therefore, having a tool that's able to monitor cloud workloads and even multi-cloud workloads, so not just in Azure, but in other public clouds as well, and give that visibility of what it discovers, detect even vulnerabilities, and recommend how we can then harden those workloads according to best practices, which was one of the answers we also got based on the mentee question. We also then want to, again, going back to the loop that we showed, we want to remediate potential vulnerabilities in automatic fashion. And all of that is then crucial in improving an organization's security posture. So Azure Security Center can help us here to improve our security posture by scanning our subscription, looking at the resources, and then giving us recommendations on how to actually harden those and apply security best practices to them. Now, Security Center does have a lot of capabilities, more than I could cover here, I believe, in the time that we have. So for simplicity's sake, I will divide these two into two major cloud security pillars. One is called the Cloud Security Posture Management, or CSPM, as I'm going to refer to it from now on, and Cloud Workload Protection Platform, CWPP, or some even call it CWP. So this terminology comes from Gartner. And if we zoom just very, very briefly into the first one, so the CSPM pillar, this is all about making sure that we proactively address any kind of vulnerability on our cloud workloads. We want to apply best practices here for securing and for hardening those workloads and resources. So CSPM, we can think of it as a more proactive approach. So meaning it gives you the actions you need to do in form of recommendations to improve your security posture. So it also decreases the likelihood of getting compromised. And what can help here was also one thing that was the answer in our mentee question, which was secure score. And secure score is important because it will continuously scan the environment, and it will give us a score that tells you how is your environment currently doing from a CSPM perspective. So the objective should always be to reach 100% or get as close to it as possible by addressing all the security recommendations and thereby then enhancing the security posture of the organization. So when you select recommendations, you have a list of security controls where each security control has a list then of dedicated recommendations. As you start addressing those successfully, it's important that you address all recommendations inside of a particular security control for your secure score to increase by the certain amount of points for that specific control. I would like to touch here also on how it's calculated. So the overall maximum of secure score is 58 points. And it's calculated based on the logic that is shown in this table. It is a static value, meaning regardless of the environment, enable MFA, for example, as the first control in the table, it will contribute 10 points towards your overall security score. Now, depending on the type and number of resources that you deploy, the overall max score in some cases might even be lower than 58 points. This is because it reflects the controls that are relevant to your environment. In example, if you don't have a VM deployed and networking resources, you won't even see the secure management ports control because it's not applicable to your environment. So 58 is a theoretical maximum, but depending on your environment, it might be lower. And secure score is always calculated based on the maximum number of points compared to the number of points that you have in your environment. If that is equal, then you get a secure score of 100%. And even using a secure score as a security KPI is very powerful because it allows you to track the progress you're making with regards to improving your security posture. So here I just have a very simplified example where over time you would like to see your secure score improving. So here in this example in September it was 57, then increased in October and in November. And this increase is then due to security recommendations being remediated and the overall security posture being improved. Now, the other way around is what happens, for example, when we see a dip in our secure score. So this example shows we went again from 57% in September. We went slightly up in October, and then there was a dip. And this dip could be contributed to then deploying resources in not a secure by default manner. So in this example, new VMs were provisioned and new storage accounts were provisioned. So these storage accounts could have, for example, not enforced HTTPS access. Therefore, for those, you would then get recommendations. And since they weren't deployed in a manner secured by default or considering best practices, there will be then a dip in secure score. So very important to think of when deploying resources, always to adhere to security best practices. And then taking the learnings that we surface in secure score and while remediating recommendations, also then implementing it in, well, some organizations have a deployment process, change management process, this might vary. But the idea behind it is to then, as we are going about remediating and improving our security posture, we don't want to constantly play catch up. We want to make sure when we remediate something that also reflects in our deployment procedure, that also then ideally we're shifting it towards the left as much as possible. So ideally we want to get to that far left where we have code and even building, testing, maybe staging. But even if it's just deployments, and here we can then leverage Azure policy, which is a huge warning. Instead of just going into Security Center and remediating everything, getting to that ideal secure score, which for some organizations might be 90 to 95%, and then seeing drops, it's important then to take those learnings and to apply them. So to have guardrails in place through, for example, Azure policy, it can be even Azure blueprints, for example, and making sure that we then also reflect it those security best practices, I should say, are reflected in the actual deployment. And again, ideally shifting it left as possible. So even to build, test, and to code. Now, I would like to touch very, very briefly on the second pillar, because once security practices have been applied, it's important to then monitor the environment for threats. And should there be a potential attack on the environment in progress, one of the most common ones still is the RDP brute force attack on VMs. And without the monitoring capability of ASC, it would be difficult to detect these and other types of attacks. So which is why, in addition to the CSPM pillar in Security Center, we also have the CWPP, or some refer to as CWP, so the Cloud Workload Protection Platform pillar. And this provides then security analytics, which are dedicated for each workload. This set of capabilities is referred to as Azure Defender. So when you hear Azure Defender, you can correlate it to the CWPP pillar inside of Azure Security Center that provides threat protection. And with Azure Defender for Microsoft, it's really about, acknowledging that there is this also reactive part of building a holistic security posture. We even provide a way here to be very, very granular by selecting for which type of resources or workloads you are interested in having threat protection. And this then kind of comes together with CSPM and CWPP, where you can not only then apply security best practices and harden resources, but also then have analytics that are dedicated to different workloads, which can be Azure Defender for Server, SQL, and all of those analytics were, again, created on this principle to identify threat actors according to the cyber kill chain model. So we are mentioned shift left, and one of the ideas behind it is to identify attackers and potential attacks that are in the beginner stage of their kind of exploratory journey. For example, in this slide, it could be the target and attack phase. But regardless of that phase, Azure Defender gives us what I'm going to call also distribute analytics, so across the whole cyber kill chain, meaning if you're not able to identify a potential attack in the beginner stage, the target and attack, you are able to identify it in other phases. So Azure Defender covers those as well. What I've thought I would do here is just briefly for your reference, as this is going to be recorded as well, showcase which resources are then can be covered by Azure Defender. And again, this is the ability here is to be very, very granular. So you can, inside of a particular subscription or management group, you can select one particular resource type or all of them. So you have that granularity. So a couple of worthwhile highlighting, most common ones are the tile counter is Azure Defender for VMs, for containers. For SQL, for Azure SQL, it's interesting because the idea behind it, behind Azure Defender for data, I should better say, is to provide that threat protection for data in general. So we're looking to cover not only Azure SQL, but also other places, if I can call it such, where data might reside, such as Azure Synapse, Manages, SQL Manage Instance, and even since built, we also have then MariaDB, MySQL, and others. What's also interesting, and this is again that continuous innovation happening, where we're also then looking at not only providing threat protection, so Azure Defender capabilities for dedicated workloads, but also for Azure Service Layer. So we also then have Azure Defender, which is part of Azure Defender for Servers, provides provides threat protection for Azure networking. We also have Azure Defender for Key Vault, for Azure Resource Manager, which is super interesting, and also for Azure DNS. It is possible to also then leverage the ASC capabilities. So we are going away with this slide. What I want to touch upon is we are going away from Azure Security Center being perceived as just something for Azure. We are supporting multi-cloud and hybrid as well through the integration with Azure Arc. And this is not solely for CSPM. We are looking to support more and more Azure Defender plans as time goes by. So again, seeing that ASE has two pillars, CSPM and CWPP, we're not only looking to provide CSPM capabilities for multi-cloud and on-prem, but also CWP capabilities. So cloud workload platform protection capabilities for multi-clouds and for on-prem. And one thing I want to touch with this section is something also very, very important when we think of that feedback loop where we protect workloads, we detect threats and or misconfigurations, and we then remediate. And that remediation comes in the form of automation. Now, as part of Azure Security Center, there is also the ability to take data outside of it and maybe send it to, for example, a SIEM, regardless be it Sentinel or be it a third-party SIEM, or maybe to some centralized governance and risk management tool for it to be consumed by it. And what's also interesting is similar to what we covered last time I was here with regards to Sentinel. As part of AST, we also have this workflow automation where we're able then to create rules that are gonna then automate that remediation capabilities by leveraging logic apps. This slide was put together by a good colleague of mine, Tom, who together with Nicholas delivered a webinar on automation capabilities that I strongly encourage everyone to watch because it's top notch. And this slide I borrowed from Tom because it also helps to understand what automation capabilities to use when. So there are different types of automation capabilities that can be leveraged when we talk about Azure Security Center. PowerShell and Azure CLI are obviously good. We see them as being very, very good for those one-time tasks. So Tom even kindly here gave a couple of examples such as configuration, so configuring something, exporting data, or maybe even pulling data. When we talk about automating through APIs, so we can use it then either in logic apps, web services, or other types of services. And logic apps is that then a low code automation for something that's recurring, that needs to be done very, very often, or it can also be done on demand, which means whenever we need to. There is also, I do believe firmly that communities make more possible, similar to this community and other communities, which is why as part of the product itself, there is also the GitHub Repository, which is maintained by the product group colleagues on my team. And it's something like a knowledge base that keeps on growing, if I can describe it as such. So there are a lot of artifacts there. Artifacts being logic apps, workbooks, everything that can help someone as they look to adopt more and more Azure Security Center and Azure Defender. Now with that, I do want to pause here before the demo just to make sure and to check if we have any questions. As I'm working on one screen today, I'm not able to see the chat window. So let me very, very quickly.
No problem. There's no questions in the chat as yet, but if anybody has any questions for Bojan, flick on your mic and chat away.
Yeah, I have a question. Does the GitHub repository also contains the security assessments that are in the Azure policies?
Great question, but which assessments specifically?
One policy, for example, is that internet-facing VMs should have an NSG, and that policy does a security assessment. But that security assessment isn't, you can't see into the security assessment.
Okay, gotcha. So thank you for that. It's a great question. So the way my brain understood it is if we on GitHub maybe surface the logic and behind the assessments that we have. Yeah. The short answer is no. Because we're constantly improving those, new ones are being added. And the way we see GitHub is mostly as a knowledge base on how to automate things and how to get even more value out of Azure Security Center. So why would I, for example, go and build a logic app from scratch for a highly used scenario where I can just go and copy paste the template? Now, with that being said, if there's with regards to maybe going deeper into the product itself, so the best place for that would be the official doc site, which I can happily paste towards the end also in the chat window, because the doc site are always going to be updated and they're always going to be highlighting. As far as I know, we're not going to be highlighting very much the secret sauce behind the assessments, but we will be highlighting, however, the most important changes and the logic of the product itself. So great point. Thank you for that, because that also helps me then to distinguish where to go for the product information and product insights. That's the doc site. And for GitHub, it's mostly on how to automate things and how to get even more value out of the product. So logic apps, workbooks, and even a couple of other things that I'm going to share a little bit later on. But before I do, I see we have actually, I hope that answers the question. Did we have maybe a follow-up question or more questions before I go to the chat window and answer those?
No, those were my questions. Thank you.
But yeah, okay. So with that, let me then switch gears, and hopefully everyone can see the browser that's shared, which has the Azure Security Center dashboard.
Sure can.
Brilliant. Thanks for confirming, Carl. So I do want to make sure we also leave time for Q&A, but I want to make sure that also here we kind of bring everything together. So Azure Security Center is part of Azure. So meaning I went ahead, logged into the Azure portal and navigated to Azure Security Center. So this is the main dashboard. There are a couple of things that we're going to dive in here directly because I also want to make sure you also know how you can get started with Security Center. But before we go about how would we actually start with Security Center in a real world scenario, I do want to just very, very briefly cover those main concepts that we talked about. So here in the Security Center dashboard, I'm going to go ahead and navigate to Secure Score. Now I can do that either by selecting the Secure Score tile here or by selecting recommendations. Now, recommendations I'm going to see, I can either select all of them, but what's more interesting for me, for my environment here, I want to see them grouped by particular security controls. So here I have my overall secure score, 80%, not bad, but again, ideally always get to 100 or as close to it as possible. So I still have space to improve here. I want to go here in the controls, and I want to leverage the top-down approach, similar to the table that we shown. So the top-down approach means I have the controls ordered by the max score. So I can see enable MFA, max score 10. And when you think of what we shared about the max score being a static value of 58, again, depending on the environment and on the resources in it, if I look at enable MFA, 10 points, secure management ports, 8 points, and remediate vulnerabilities and apply system updates, 6 points each. So just with those four, so 6 plus 6, 12, 20, 30, I can already, with remediating just those four top security controls, I can already get 30 out of a max 58. So I can already get more than a 50% in my secure score by remediating those. Now, obviously, I want to get to 100, but I can still then use this top-down approach to prioritize. Inside of a particular control are recommendations that are part of that control. Now, as part of each control, I have my max score, the current score, and the potential score increase. The potential score increase is important because, well, not for enable MFA because I already went and implemented this one, but if I take remediate vulnerabilities, because this one has a max score of 6 and a current score of 0, so I have a lot of space to improve here. Because I also have a 6-point potential score increase. In order to get this 6 points, now in this case, I just need to remediate one recommendation. If I had several here, I would need to remediate all the recommendations that are part of a particular security control to get my full potential score increase. Now, how does this look like? Let me just quickly select a recommendation. And here, depending on the permissions that my user has, I can see a short description. I can even see guidance on how to remediate it. And there is this thing that's called a quick fix. Now, quick fix is something that's out of the box available for me to remediate these recommendations and others as well, which are supported on the resources that I select. So in my case, I have 3 VMs. If I had 300, for example, I could at scale select all of them, and I could select fix, meaning I could then remediate them at scale just with that one quick fix option. Now, we also do have here description and what that logic really is if someone wants to make sure that they understand what's going to happen here before they select quick fix. And once I've done that, there's also somewhat recent addition was the freshness interval. So I need to wait up to 24 hours to then see the effect of it on my secure score. But I'm going to go ahead and exit this recommendation because I want to also show that when I click response actions, I can also select fix. So I'm going to see which security controls and which recommendations under it support the quick fix option. Let's say if I was now going into my environment, I'm at 80, I want to get to then 95, maybe 90 over the short term, and then above 90 in the midterm. So I can even then just by using this filter already for remediate vulnerabilities, I see I have a quick fix option. Now, quick fix is great, but again, when we think about new resources being deployed in Azure and in other clouds, I want to make sure I take these learnings and I want to make sure that those best practices here are then implemented in either the deployment process, so I could then leverage it by updating ARM templates or other deployment procedures that the organization that I'm part of is using. Again, super important not just to go here and select a quick fix and then see the secure score increase. We want to make sure it stays at that increased level, which means we want to make sure that new resources, if we're deploying them, that they're secured by default, meaning we want to take these learnings, we want to go back to the deployment process or even to the coding and build process stage, and we want to make sure we kind of implement those. Now, one thing we covered was very, very important in Secure Score was the whole CSPM point of view. What I also want to showcase is Azure Defender. But for Azure Defender, which is all about threat protection for dedicated workloads, I can go to pricing and settings. I can select a particular management group, or in my case, it's going to be just one subscription. And here I can granularly select. Now, in my case, I selected all of them. However, I can be granular here depending on the resources that I have in this subscription and select a particular Azure Defender plan. So I don't need to enable all of them. I can be very, very granular here and select only a particular one. Once I have done so depending on the plan that I have enabled, now, Azure Defender for servers, when we look at the evolution of Azure Security Center, so if you came across or worked with Security Center, let's say 2 years ago, you might still remember what was back then, I believe, referred to as the Advanced Cloud Defense. So in a nutshell, Security Center had a list of capabilities listed on the far left-hand side, which were called the Advanced Cloud Defense. Capabilities such as just-in-time VM access, adaptive application control, and others. And because of the evolution of the product, we then started adding new capabilities, so new Azure Defender plans, meaning now when I go into Azure Defender, I can see its coverage. I can see even then the particular services and or I should better say resource types that are covered by it. But I can still find those previously known as advanced cloud defense capabilities as part of the advanced protection here. So vulnerability assessment provided through Qualys, just-in-time VM access, and everything else that you see here. Now, just one thing I want to cover on the VA, so vulnerability assessment. A way to see it is a series of security checks being performed either on the VM, or in this case for SQL VA, it would be on the DB itself, so on the SQL instance. So again, vulnerability assessment, the way my brain always perceives it, as a way to perform a series of checks. Now I can go with these advanced protection capabilities, and I can configure these as well. So again, these would then give me that threat protection for dedicated workloads. Once I've done so, I can actually, as part of the security alerts, I can then see Azure Defender detecting potential attacks and highlighting them here. Now, I did a couple of tests here for app service instance, the likes of eCar and so, but it's even possible without doing a full-blown validation scenario. As part of the sample alerts here, I can select the particular Azure Defender plan, and I can even create on-demand sample alerts. I did that a while ago, and I do have a couple of here, and the look and feel is very, very similar to if you were part of the session that when we talked about Azure Sentinel. So you have rich metadata, you can even video fill details. What's very interesting is the mapping to the MITRE attack framework. So it even maps it back to MITRE. You have the details and you have the take action. So the take action is important because, again, we want to prevent future attacks from happening. It's never a good thing to see a bunch of security alerts or Azure Defender picking a lot of stuff up once we enable it. This is one of those things where even some customers say, well, I see Azure Defender is picking up a lot of things. That's good. It means that it's working. Well, I would just like to ground us in the fact what Azure Defender really is. It's that dedicated threat protection. It's threat protection for dedicated workloads. So if it's generating a lot of alerts, that's usually not a very, very good sign. So we want to prevent future security alerts such as these ones from happening. We can do it either by, again, implementing and remediating the recommendations, which are, again, security best practices, or we can even trigger logic caps. So logic caps is if I go into the workflow automation, again, logic caps is how do we make sure that once we detected something that we can automatically remediate it. Tom and Safina on my team, they did this brilliant logic cap when, for example, again, one of the most common VM attacks or attacks on VMs is an RDP brute force attacks. So they did a logic cap and automation, which is able when Azure Defender, so in this case, it would be Azure Defender for servers, picks up a RDP brute force attack, the logic cap that they built is going to take the attacker's IP address and it's going to automatically then create an NSG and make sure that that is blocked. So that's a great example of having it here, and also having, in case someone does have a SIM and or centralized SOAR, those are still great use cases to have here inside of Security Center, in addition to everything else that a company and organization might already be using. I did touch base on Azure policy itself. So a way to look at Azure Security Center, and one might ask, well, there are a lot of recommendations that I saw there. Off the back of what is actually Security Center then generating all of those? And it's generating it based on a custom policy initiative. So meaning here, Azure Security Center, once we enable it, it creates one per default, which we can always also edit, which is also one of those very, very often questions when, for example, MFA. If someone is using a third-party MFA and doesn't believe that the recommendation enable MFA is applicable to their environment, so they can go here and they can edit the assessment by selecting what I just did, going to the parameters, and then identifying the particular one. And in my case, it could be that my user, So my user doesn't have actually the privilege here, but I would be able then to select the one that I would like to disable for that environment. So it is created out of the box, but it's still possible to customize it and even add custom initiatives. So for example, as part of recommendations, I can even add custom recommendations here. Similarly, also, there is also the regulatory compliance capability. And this is very, very powerful if we're looking to kind of unblock an environment to achieve a particular standard or particular compliance requirement. So Azure Security Benchmark is the default one, and it's very, very heavily based on CIS. So it's very, very cloud heavy, and it's focused on CIS and on NIST. And it's the default benchmark in ASC. So here we can even expand all the compliance controls and see which ones we are currently fulfilling. We can also add others out of the box. And similarly, we can also create what I did here, a custom one, and then leverage the groups in Azure policy to even have it grouped here. Now that's a lot of information. So I want to make sure that I don't see the chat window. So let me very, very quickly switch to see if we have any questions here.
I have a question on the FIM, the file integration monitoring.
Yes, tackle that.
Yeah, so for the VM, like we have the FIM there, but we don't have for the web app. So do we need a FIM for web app, or it's not needed? Because sometimes the customer move from VM to the web app. They ask like we have the FIM enabled for the VM, but it's not enabled for the like web app. It's not supported, or it's not there out of box. So what do you say? FIM is enabled by default from the in the background by Microsoft for the web app, or is in the plan to in the future to enable it?
Thank you for that. So if it kind of broke up on my side, so the way I understood it is FIM, which is file integrity monitoring, which is an Azure Defender capability. Does it out of the box support web apps? Does that sound about right?
No, that is out of box for the VM, but not for the web app.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so sometimes like customer want like they want, so when they move from VM to the web app, they want like we had the FIM for the VM. I want same thing for the web app as well. So but it's not here. So is any plan on that, or it's not supported? In thought here?
Okay, a couple of things there. As of today, we don't have that. So we're always looking then to also support and add new functionalities as we go along. The one thing I will say is I would see that as part of Azure Defender for App Service rather than Azure Defender for VMs. So I would be more than closely watching the announcements in Azure Defender for App Service for that scenario than for VMs.
Okay. So right now there like no any FIM integration in the web app in the background.
Can you tell us if it's on the roadmap, Bojan?
Are you recording this?
Yes.
Well, I do believe communities make more possible. With that being said, our roadmap is under NDA. So it would kind of look very, very bad for me to say something, for our colleagues to put so much effort and for it to be on YouTube. So that would kind of make me look not so great.
We won't tell anybody.
Let's do that after the recording.
That's very kind of you, Carl. I will say this for this scenario again. Sakaldeb, great question. I would be looking towards what's going to be coming up in the Azure Defender for App Service plan rather than the Azure Defender for Server Service plan.
Okay. Yeah.
Great questions, though. Do we have more questions? Or was everything super, super clear?
Great so far, yeah.
Yeah, it was clear so far.
Okay, just a quick time check. So we are on the hour. So what I would like to do is I would like to make sure that we also have a couple more minutes for Q&A. So I'm gonna stop the demo here. Maybe one thing before we kind of transition back to the slide deck. One thing I also want to leave you with is, and this might be, some might, be interested. Okay, it looks great from, what it does, what it can do, but how do we get started? And that's a big thing. So it's how do we get started, because every journey is different, every organization is different. So as part of Azure Security Center, again, communities make more possible. So when you select the community here, is as part of it, you can also go to the community GitHub. So when you select it, you will get to the official GitHub repository maintained by the product group, so the team that even I'm part of. As part of that, which is loading a little bit here, you will be able to then, again, to Stefan's point, is you're able to see resources that allow you to make even more use of the product, or kind of supercharge your use of Azure Security Center and or Azure Defender, which is why here you can find not just labs, which are great if you're starting or maybe doing discovery of Azure Security Center. So you start by creating a subscription, a trial, understanding the dashboard, a lot of the things that we covered here. So it's a great way to kind of get an understanding of Azure Security Center. What's also, as part of the official GitHub repo, you have the onboarding section, which I have opened here. And this is for companies, big or small, how to get started. So this is not just something that's applicable for the large enterprise, it's something that's very much applicable also to the small and medium businesses out there. So this provides a step-by-step guide of what are the prerequisites and what are the steps you need to take to onboard an organization to Azure Security Center and or Azure Defender. So after the prerequisites here, you can see even understanding the roles, the different permissions. Again, Azure policy is huge because it goes back to that governance aspect. So we want to make sure that we take those learnings. We want to make sure that what we remediated, that we kind of feed that back into our organization's knowledge base, if I can call it, or change management processes or whatever, and make sure that we then in the future deploy resources secure by default. You can also then here follow the onboarding, so enabling plans, setting security contact emails, very important, because again, when we talk about security alerts, those are then going to be leveraged here, and deploying agents. Now, I didn't cover this because there is work going on here that I'm just going to say, be on the lookout for what's going to be happening in this space. A lot of improvements, and also a lot of excitement, and also the management of it. So deploying, for example, automation such as logic caps, taking data through continuous export out of ASC and exporting it to a SIM or a different type of a system, such as a central GRC system, for example, and also connecting it to a ITCM, for example, ServiceNow. So this is all available as part of the onboarding here. So again, labs, great if you want to get an understanding, hands-on understanding of ASC. Onboarding, if you're looking to onboard an organization, big or small, to Azure Security Center. And obviously then a lot of other content here. Workbooks, a big one. So how you can leverage Azure Workbooks to create rich visualizations, Custo queries, maybe to mention a couple of other ones. REST API, very, very interesting when you're looking how to do something at scale through APIs. A lot of great examples here. PowerShell as well. So I hope you get the gist. A lot of things here. So always worthwhile to checking before you start doing a workbook or an automation. Always worthwhile checking out the GitHub community. With that, maybe just to close it with workbooks, which is something that was a somewhat recent addition, and it's all about providing those rich visualizations, similar to what you can also find in Azure Sentinel or any kind of a SIM of sort. What's specific, however, for Azure Security Center is you have templates and workbooks that are made available out of the box. You can also create your own. So you're not limited just using these. You can always create your own, or you can leverage the ones that we have here in the GitHub on the community. So here you can even find more of them. What's interesting about workbooks is you can also then leverage, if I take, for example, secure score over time, I'm just going to select a workspace, which in my case is going to be Contoso. And I'm able to, when we were talking about using your score as a KPI, I'm able, by leveraging this workbook, to also, for example, business stakeholders, maybe even the C-suite, I'm able to provide an understanding of what's our current security posture, or what's the current security posture of our organization, and how is it behaving, taking into consideration the time range here and period. And what's also important, we can then do analysis of not just secure score as an all-up measure, but also on particular controls over time. So which ones are increasing, which ones are hopefully not decreasing, and what are the top recommendations that we probably need then to feed back in either into our development process and or the deployment process. Okay, so a lot of content. So with that, let me then go back to the slides. I do believe the only slide that I have is this one. So thank you for having me. Firstly, secondly, thank you for the discussion. I do have a couple more minutes. If we do have more questions, happy to stay and answer those.
Thank you very much, Bojan. That's an excellent session again. We'll have to get you on for a repeat of Sentinel or a completely different topic the next time. If anybody has any questions, just switch on your mic, switch on your camera, or do one or the other and ask some questions.
Well, I actually do have one question about using quick fix action. Is there a risk of breaking things by doing remediation through the quick fix?
It's a great question, Camille. I hope I'm saying the name correctly. Ideally, the way quick fix works is providing the organization the ability to improve their security posture at scale by selecting all of those resources and then selecting one button so I can at scale improve my security posture. With that being said, one of the questions that comes up often is, okay, but what does it do? Does it actually break things? Which is why I always recommend, as part of before going into quick fix itself, just having a quick look at what is the logic that the quick fix is going to do. And if that is something that the organization can then second, best also to start small. So to have a couple of maybe servers, or depending on the resource type in question, remediating those before doing really full-blown like 600 VMs or something similar. So to answer your question is, it doesn't break things. The logic is well defined, but we still need to kind of follow the established process. So make sure, do our due diligence, and then also start small and expand on it. But we are going to be adding even more quick fixes. Hope that's okay to say it, but now it's already too late. So we're looking to add even more quick fixes to more recommendations, because the idea behind it is, how can we help an organization come to a higher secure score, so an improved security posture quite quickly. And one way of doing it is also through quick fixes, to provide that one button, so that quick remediation logic. And then obviously taking those learnings and feeding them through Azure Policy, or maybe even Azure Blueprints, or it can be even the CI/CD pipeline, and making sure that those resources are deployed secure by default. Hope that answers your question, and happy to answer any follow-ups.
That's great, thank you. I actually have one more about the policies and Azure Blueprints. So let's say you have Blueprint including, let's say, some of the settings that you have in another policy. Would it conflict in any way? So let's say like when you use Intune or Microsoft Endpoint Manager, when you have two policies having the same setting, they will conflict if they're set differently. So is there something within the policies and blueprints that would actually overlap and make the policy conflict and the report false positive?
So it's a great point. So if I understood the question correctly, is what happens if, for example, I have two or more policies that are conflicting, correct?
You have the same setting. Let's say enable backup for Azure VMs when you deploy VM, apply tags, and etc. And some of these might be included in Blueprint, and then you have another set of policies applied. Let's say a different management group or different subscription, still inheriting the Blueprint from the top, but it's assigned to a specific resource, so to speak.
Okay, there were a couple of things there. So the first thing is first, so when I enable Azure Security Center, it's gonna out of the box create a policy for me. So it's gonna leverage Azure policy and it's gonna create one that's gonna be what I showed ASC default, and then a very, very unfriendly user kind of extension of that name. So that's gonna be Azure based on Azure policy. So I can always go there, I can always and that will have then the scope. So it's going to be either the management group, it's going to be the subscription that I enabled it on. So that will have a scope, and I can always go there, and I can always then also amend that policy as I showed by editing the assignment or editing the policy. Now, to your point is, yes, there is the possibility that someone in the organization who doesn't own, for example, Azure Security Center, that they're also deploying policies. But the place to see that wouldn't actually be in Security Center, because that would be then in the Azure policy portal itself. Or I should better say in the Azure policy dashboard of the Azure portal. So the Azure policy dashboard would be then the ideal place to see those potential conflicts. And when I think of blueprints, is going maybe a level thing, what is in addition to policy, so in addition to the guardrails, what are, for example, the templates, the ARM templates that I need to actually deploy my resources in a secure way, maybe even roles that are needed as part of that process. So that would be kind of, for me, the blueprint. It would be going even a step further. But in short, to answer your question, the ideal place to see it wouldn't be in Security Center. It would actually be in Azure Policy and resolving any conflict there if one exists at all. So it should be then popping up as non-compliant or an issue with compliance. And the long answer, I just gave it to you.
I think it also very depends on what type of policy it is. I mean, if you have a policy that audits resources, then you can have as many assignments as you want, but they will just return the same results. But if you have a restrictive policy like allowed locations, I think if you have an assignment restricting you from creating resources in West Europe, and you also have an assignment restricting you from creating resources in North Europe, then both of them will be in effect. So they add up, and I think it takes the path of deny first, let's say, so something like that.
But that then again goes outside of Azure Security Center and goes more into the Azure policy realm. And it is a fair question, and it is a fair point, because Azure Security Center kind of sits in the middle of everything. When we covered kind of Sentinel in the previous conversation we had, we kind of took all the goodness and brought it into Sentinel in our own word, and we could do whatever we wanted with it. Whereas with Azure Security Center, we're kind of in the middle of everything. We use Azure Policy, we use Logic Apps. A couple of things that, we didn't have time to cover today was even multi-cloud. So there is the ability to, even through cloud connectors, to connect to an AWS account, such as a master account, or a GCP, I believe it's called a project, if I'm not mistaken. So it's even possible then to connect to other clouds as well. So it makes it even more than interesting, because it sits kind of in the middle of everything, and now it's even becoming, again, it's going away from Azure Security Center being something for Azure and being something as Security Center for overall clouds. So yeah, great point. I do see someone having their hand up. Christopher, please go ahead.
Yeah, all it is, I'm just been thinking there. For example, if you're using something like infrastructure as code to roll something out, is there an option within Security Center to import that code, get it to check everything, and then make recommendations before it's deployed into the real world, should we say?
You're talking about code scanning, right?
Yeah.
As of today, no. We don't have that kind of a capability in Azure Security Center. However, there are actually tools that can do that. I believe I even have a couple of them. Not one is coming to mind now, but there are a couple of them that I'm happy to follow up offline that can be used for that, especially for scanning, for example, ARM templates.
Yeah, I was thinking more of something so before you roll out the computer or whatever, it scans it so it's fully compliant with Security Center.
Maybe something for in a build pipeline.
Yeah, so almost a what if,
Yeah.
and then that what if is scanned by your Azure policy and your Azure Security Center. Sounds like an email to the product group, Bojan.
So there is actually something, it's not quite the ARM template scanning capability, Christopher. It is something like more towards scanning the CI/CD pipeline. So that's something that is already went public preview. So there is that capability to do, I'm going to call them a series of security checks in, for example, CI/CD pipeline before that, for example, gets pushed, to Azure or I believe currently it's to Azure. So there is that, for example, but again, natively for scanning ARM templates inside of ASC, no. However, there are other tools that do it. Then if I can be as cheeky as to say, the idea is never to reinvent the wheel, is really to do something then better than anyone else. And this is kind of where Security Center fits in. But I do actually have a couple of those tools that actually there was a Cloud Advocate that did recently a session, and they even highlighted a couple that they use personally. So happy to check with them if they have an updated list and share those with you if it's of real value.
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
So Carl, I believe we said everyone with a great question gets a voucher, right? So a lot of vouchers being handed out.
Everybody's getting a voucher anyway tonight, so it's all good. Thank you, Bojan. Excellent session, excellent questions. I enjoy it when these sessions have discussions after them, so that we can get into the nuts and bolts of the technology we're exploring. So that's good. So it's not just someone gives a session and we all, at this time of night, we probably all go and get a cup of tea and go to bed, but because I'm old and boring, so that's what I'm doing. But no, thank you, Bojan. That's been an excellent session. Thank you, everybody, for attending again. Next month's session is advanced Azure Cosmos DB and some optimization. So if you're touching Cosmos DB in your day-to-day or you want to know more about it, please join us. Off the top of my head, I cannot remember that date. 22nd of September. So thank you all. See you then, hopefully. Bojan, if you want to follow up with myself or Shackledeep, or just tweet and tag us in it with some responses if you need to, that would be great. Again, thank you very much for your time. It's really appreciated.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.
Thanks all.
Cheers, guys.